The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that presses down on your chest. All eyes were on the man standing at the defendant's table. His tattered jacket hung loosely on his shoulders, his hair unkempt, and his boots scuffed from years of wear. This was Daniel Cooper, a homeless veteran accused of trespassing. The prosecutor presented their case with confidence, but Daniel's demeanor was calm. As the judge asked if he had anything to say in his defense, Daniel hesitated for a moment, then nodded. What he said next made everyone's jaw drop. "I know why I'm here," he began, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. "But before you pass judgment on me, there's something you need to know. The land I'm accused of trespassing on, it belongs to me." The courtroom erupted into whispers, the judge pounding the gavel for order. Everyone stared at Daniel, trying to process his claim. How could a man who appeared to have nothing say he owned a piece of land valuable enough for someone to call the police over? The judge leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Cooper, are you suggesting you own the property in question? Do you have proof?" Daniel lowered his gaze, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. "I can explain everything," he said, "but it's a long story." The judge, intrigued despite himself, agreed to hear it. The prosecutor and the defense attorney exchanged skeptical glances, but the courtroom settled down, eager to hear what the homeless man had to say. Daniel took a deep breath, his voice softening as he began to recount his journey. Daniel's life hadn't always been this way. He grew up in a small town in Indiana, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. His parents were farmers, and though they weren't wealthy, they were rich in love and laughter. Daniel spent his childhood running through cornfields, helping his father fix fences, and listening to his mother hum as she prepared supper. He enlisted in the military right out of high school, eager to serve his country and make his family proud. The years in uniform shaped him, teaching him discipline and resilience, but they also exposed him to the harsh realities of life. War changed him, as it did so many others, but Daniel carried on, determined to build a future for himself when his service was done. After returning home, Daniel used his savings to start a small carpentry business. His hands, rough from years of work, created beautiful pieces of furniture that sold well in the local market. For a while, life was good. He even bought a piece of land, a small plot on the outskirts of town that he dreamed of turning into a haven. But life has a way of taking unexpected turns. The 2008 financial crisis hit, and like so many others, Daniel lost everything. His business went under, his savings dwindled, and before long, he was living out of his truck. He tried to get back on his feet, but the economy wasn't forgiving. Jobs were scarce, and people were struggling to keep their own homes, let alone hire a carpenter. Daniel ended up on the streets, moving from city to city in search of work. He carried a photo of his parents and a small Bible, both of which he kept in a pocket close to his heart. Despite the hardships, he never lost hope. He believed in the kindness of strangers and the power of resilience, even as the world seemed determined to beat him down. The prosecutor interrupted Daniel's story, questioning its relevance to the case. But the judge, intrigued by the unfolding narrative, allowed him to continue. Daniel's eyes flicked to the prosecutor, then back to the judge. "I'm getting there," he assured them. He spoke of the years he spent moving from shelter to shelter, the friends he made and lost along the way, and the moments of humanity that kept him going, a warm meal from a stranger, a kind word when he needed it most. He talked about the day he stumbled upon the piece of land in question, how he recognized it instantly. "It was mine," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I bought it years ago, before I lost everything. It was supposed to be my sanctuary." The judge leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "If this land was yours, why didn't you do anything to protect it?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "I tried. But when you're homeless, people don't take you seriously. The records, they got lost, or maybe someone didn't care enough to keep them straight. I don't know. But that land was mine, and when I saw someone building on it, I couldn't just walk away." The courtroom buzzed with whispered speculation. Was Daniel telling the truth? Could a man who had nothing left still hold on to something as significant as land? The judge raised a hand for silence. "We'll need to verify your claims, Mr. Cooper. But for now, let's focus on the trespassing charge. What exactly happened that day?" Daniel looked down at his hands, the weight of his story evident in his posture. He began to recount the events that led to his arrest, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. The night Daniel was arrested, he had been walking back to the spot where he usually slept, a small corner behind an old warehouse. He passed by the construction site on his former land, a pang of sadness hitting him as he saw the foundations of a building going up. It wasn't just any building, it was a luxury development, far removed from the modest dreams he once had for the place. Something in him snapped. He climbed the fence, driven by a mix of anger and desperation, and wandered the site, trying to make sense of what was happening. He found an old oak tree still standing, one he used to sit under when he visited the land years ago. I sat there, Daniel said, his voice soft. I wasn't trying to cause trouble. I just wanted to feel close to it again. The security guard found him there, and the rest was history. Daniel was arrested for trespassing, his explanation dismissed as the ramblings of a man with nowhere else to go. As Daniel's story came to an end, the courtroom was silent once more. The judge looked at him for a long moment before speaking. You've given us a lot to think about, Mr. Cooper. But this court requires evidence to support your claims. Daniel nodded, a faint smile on his lips. I know, he said. And I have it. But finding it won't be easy. The prosecutor scoffed, but the judge silenced them with a sharp look. We'll adjourn for now, the judge said. When we return, I expect you to provide that evidence. Daniel nodded again, his expression resolute. The courtroom emptied, but the questions lingered. Was Daniel telling the truth? Could he really prove his ownership of the land? And if he could, what would that mean for the case? Outside the courtroom, Daniel sat on a bench, staring at his hands. He had opened a door he wasn't sure he could close, and the stakes had never been higher. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as people filed back in the next day. News of Daniel Cooper's claim had spread, drawing a larger crowd. Journalists whispered among themselves, scribbling notes and adjusting cameras. A homeless veteran claiming to own prime real estate? It was the kind of story that sold headlines. Daniel sat at the defendant's table, his expression calm but his fingers betraying a nervous tremor. He clutched a worn leather folder in his lap, the faintest hint of a smile on his face. It wasn't confidence, it was determination. The judge called the court to order and addressed Daniel. Mr. Cooper, you stated yesterday that you have evidence to support your claim of ownership. The court is prepared to review it. Daniel stood, the leather folder in his hands trembling slightly. Your Honor, he said, his voice steady despite the pressure, what I have here is a deed. It's old, and I know it doesn't look like much, but it's the only proof I've got. He approached the bench, handing the folder to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The courtroom was so quiet that the rustling of papers seemed deafening. The judge examined the document, his brow furrowing as he read. This is dated 2006, the judge said, looking up at Daniel. But it's incomplete. There's no official seal from the county registrar. The prosecutor seized the opportunity, standing with a smug expression. Your Honor, this so-called deed is irrelevant without proper certification. Anyone could fabricate a piece of paper and call it a deed. Daniel turned to face the prosecutor, his eyes narrowing. It's not fabricated. It's real. I bought that land with the money I saved for my carpentry business. The registrar's office had the original records, but when the economy crashed, they said some files were misplaced. I've been trying to recover it ever since. The judge raised a hand, silencing the growing murmurs. Mr. Cooper, while your story is compelling, the law requires verifiable documentation. Do you have any witnesses or additional evidence to corroborate your claim? Daniel hesitated, then nodded. Yes. There's someone who can help, but I'll need time to find them. The prosecutor rolled their eyes. Your Honor, this is a waste of the court's time. The defendant is clearly stalling. The judge's gavel came down hard. Enough. Mr. Cooper, I'll grant you 1 week to produce this witness or any additional evidence. If you fail to do so, the court will proceed with sentencing. Daniel's shoulders sagged slightly, but he nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. As Daniel left the courthouse, the reality of his situation began to sink in. He had 1 week to find someone who could back up his claim, a near impossible task considering the years that had passed and the transient nature of his life since losing everything. He wandered the city streets, his mind racing. There was one person who might be able to help, Henry Walker, an old friend who had once worked with him on the land. Henry had been there when Daniel purchased the property and had even helped him plant the first few trees. But that was years ago, and the last time Daniel had seen Henry was shortly after the financial crash. Finding him wouldn't be easy. Daniel spent the next few days retracing his steps, visiting shelters and soup kitchens where he and Henry had once crossed paths. He asked everyone he met if they had seen a man fitting Henry's description: tall, lean, with a scruffy beard and a booming laugh that could fill a room. Most people shook their heads, but one woman at a shelter downtown recognized the name. "Henry Walker?" she asked, her brow furrowed. "I think he used to come around here a few years ago. Haven't seen him in a while, though." Daniel felt a flicker of hope. "Do you know where he might have gone?" The woman shrugged. "He talked about heading out west. Said something about finding work on a ranch." Daniel thanked her and left, the flicker of hope quickly replaced by despair. The west? That was a vast, directionless lead, and time was running out. On the fourth night, Daniel sat on a bench in the park, the folder containing his incomplete deed resting on his lap. The streetlights cast long shadows, and the chill of the evening air seeped into his bones. He felt the weight of the week pressing down on him, each passing day another reminder of how little he had to work with. As he sat there, lost in thought, a voice startled him. "Dan? Is that you?" He turned to see a man standing a few feet away, his features partially hidden by the dim light. But the voice was unmistakable. It was Henry. The reunion was bittersweet. Henry looked older, his face lined with years of hard living, but his laugh was as hearty as ever. "I can't believe it's you," he said, clapping Daniel on the shoulder. "What are you doing out here?" Daniel explained everything: the arrest, the court case, the land. Henry listened intently, his expression growing serious. "Dan," he said, "I remember that land. I remember when you bought it. If you need me to back you up, I will." Relief washed over Daniel, but it was short-lived. Henry hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "But I gotta be honest with you. There's something about that land you might not know. Something you need to hear before we walk into that courtroom." Daniel frowned, his heart sinking. "What is it?" Henry looked away, his voice dropping to a whisper. "That land. It's not just yours anymore." Daniel's heart dropped at Henry's words. "What do you mean it's not just mine anymore?" he asked, his voice sharp with urgency. Henry shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Daniel's gaze. "Look, it's complicated. After you disappeared, word got out that the property was abandoned. Some developer came snooping around, claiming they bought it at an auction." Daniel's jaw tightened. "An auction? That's impossible. I never put it up for sale." Henry sighed. "I know. But you know how these things work. When you didn't show up to pay taxes for a few years, the county seized it. They said you were unreachable, and the property went up for auction. Someone scooped it up for dirt cheap." Daniel's fists clenched at his sides. "They sold my land because I was homeless? Because I didn't have an address to send their paperwork?" Henry nodded grimly. "I don't like it either, Dan. But the system doesn't care about people like us." Daniel sat down on the bench, his mind racing. The deed in his folder, incomplete as it was, wouldn't stand against a legal sale. If the land had been auctioned, the new owner would have legitimate claims backed by documents and lawyers. But this wasn't just about ownership. This was about the principle. The land had been taken from him because of circumstances beyond his control. And now, someone was making a fortune off his loss. The next morning, Daniel and Henry sat at a diner, sipping coffee as they strategized. Henry had agreed to testify in court about Daniel's original purchase of the land, but both of them knew it might not be enough. They needed something more, a way to challenge the legality of the auction. "Do you remember the developer's name?" Daniel asked. Henry nodded. "It's a big company, Harland and Company. They've been buying up land all over the state, flipping it for luxury projects. Your land is part of some new gated community they're building." Daniel frowned. "Harland and Company? They've got a reputation for shady deals. I've heard about them cutting corners and exploiting loopholes to grab land." Henry leaned forward, lowering his voice. "That's what I'm thinking. If we can find proof that the auction wasn't on the level, you might have a chance to fight this." Daniel nodded. It was a slim chance, but it was all he had. "Where do we start?" Henry grinned. "I know a guy." That evening, they met with Henry's contact, a man named Joe who worked as a freelance investigator. Joe was in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and an easygoing demeanor that belied his sharp instincts. He listened to Daniel's story, nodding thoughtfully as he jotted down notes. "Harland and Company," Joe said, tapping his pen against his notebook. "They've got a history of bending the rules, but they're careful. If they rigged the auction, it won't be easy to prove. Daniel's shoulders sagged. So what do we do? Joe leaned back in his chair, a sly smile playing on his lips. We dig. Auctions like that leave a paper trail. If there's even a hint of foul play, I'll find it. But it'll take time. Time is the one thing I don't have, Daniel said, frustration creeping into his voice. Joe held up a hand. Relax. I'll work fast. In the meantime, you need to focus on making your case in court. Get your story straight, gather every piece of evidence you can. And don't lose hope. The next few days were a whirlwind. While Joe investigated the auction, Daniel and Henry prepared for the upcoming court hearing. Henry helped Daniel track down old photos of the land, including pictures of the oak tree and the cabin Daniel had started building before everything fell apart. They also found letters Daniel had written to the county years ago, pleading for an extension on his property taxes. The letters were never answered, but they proved he hadn't abandoned the land intentionally. On the 6th day, Joe called with an update. I've got something, he said. Meet me at my office. Daniel and Henry rushed over, their hearts pounding with anticipation. Joe greeted them with a stack of documents, his expression serious. It's not a smoking gun, he said, but it's a start. Look at this. He handed Daniel a sheet of paper, pointing to a line of text. This is the auction notice for your property. See the date? They listed it as abandoned 6 months after the deadline for back taxes. But here's the thing, legally they're supposed to wait a year. Daniel stared at the document, his mind racing. So they broke the law? Joe nodded. Looks like it. And that's not all. I cross-referenced the buyer's name with some other auctions Harland and Company participated in. There's a pattern. Properties are being flagged as abandoned suspiciously early, then sold off to Harland at rock-bottom prices. It's not just your land, they've done this all over. Daniel's hands trembled as he held the paper. For the first time, he felt a spark of hope. Can we use this in court? Joe smiled. You bet. It's not a silver bullet, but it's enough to raise serious questions about the legitimacy of the sale. If we can get the judge to dig deeper, Harland might find themselves in hot water. The day of the hearing arrived, and the courtroom was packed. The story had made headlines, and people from all walks of life had shown up to support Daniel. Homeless advocates, veterans groups, and even strangers who had read about his plight filled the gallery, their presence a testament to the impact of his fight. Daniel took the stand, his voice steady as he recounted his story. Henry followed, testifying about the purchase of the land and the plans they had made together. Finally, Joe presented his findings, laying out the discrepancies in the auction process. The judge listened carefully, his expression growing more serious as the evidence mounted. When Joe finished, the judge turned to the prosecutor, who represented Harland and Company. Do you have a response to these allegations? The judge asked. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Your Honor, the auction was conducted in accordance with all applicable laws. Any discrepancies are minor and do not invalidate the sale. The judge frowned. Minor discrepancies? Mr. Cooper's investigator has provided evidence suggesting a pattern of misconduct by your client. This court takes such allegations very seriously. The tension in the room was palpable. Daniel's fate, and the truth about his land, hung in the balance. As the judge prepared to issue a ruling, the courtroom door swung open. A woman walked in, her presence commanding immediate attention. She was dressed in a sharp suit, her expression unreadable. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady and clear. I'm here to present new evidence regarding this case. Everyone turned to stare at her, including Daniel, who had no idea who she was, or what she might reveal. The courtroom froze as the woman strode confidently toward the bench. She handed a folder to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The prosecutor's face paled as they recognized her. Your Honor, she said, I'm Elizabeth Hayes, senior legal counsel for a group investigating unethical land acquisitions. What I have here is irrefutable evidence of Harland and Company's illegal activities, including forged auction documents, bribery of county officials, and systematic targeting of vulnerable property owners like Mr. Cooper. A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Daniel sat stunned, his mind racing. He had no idea who Elizabeth was or why she had come to his aid, but her words seemed to pierce through the thick wall of doubt that had surrounded his case. The judge flipped through the documents, his face darkening as he read. He looked up, his tone sharp. Ms. Hayes, are you prepared to testify to the validity of this evidence? Elizabeth nodded. I am, Your Honor. And I'm prepared to subpoena additional witnesses, including whistleblowers from inside Harland and Company, if necessary. The prosecutor shot to their feet. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. This evidence was not submitted prior to the hearing. The judge silenced them with a wave of his hand. Irregular or not, these are serious allegations. The court will allow Ms. Hayes to testify. Elizabeth stepped onto the witness stand, her calm demeanor in stark contrast to the chaos her arrival had caused. She outlined her investigation into Harland and Company, detailing how the company had exploited legal loopholes and falsified records to acquire properties below market value. She presented emails, financial statements, and sworn affidavits from former employees who had come forward. As she spoke, the prosecutor's confidence crumbled. The evidence was damning, and it was clear that Harland and Company had not anticipated anyone digging this deep. When Elizabeth finished, the judge called for a recess to review the evidence. Daniel and Henry sat together in a corner of the courtroom, the gravity of the moment sinking in. Who is she? Daniel whispered, still trying to process everything. Henry shrugged, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. No idea. But I like her. Elizabeth approached them during the recess, extending her hand to Daniel. Mr. Cooper, she said, her voice kind. I've been following your case since it hit the news. What happened to you isn't just unfair, it's part of a larger pattern of injustice. I couldn't stand by and do nothing. Daniel shook her hand, gratitude shining in his eyes. Thank you, he said. I don't know how to repay you. Elizabeth smiled. You don't owe me anything. Just promise me you'll fight for what's right, no matter how hard it gets. When the court reconvened, the judge addressed the room. After reviewing the evidence presented by Ms. Hayes, this court finds sufficient grounds to question the legitimacy of the auction in which Mr. Cooper's property was sold. I am ordering an immediate injunction on any further development of the property and a full investigation into Harland and Company's practices. The gallery erupted into applause. Daniel felt a weight lift off his shoulders, though he knew the fight wasn't over. The injunction was a victory, but it was only the first step in reclaiming his land. The prosecutor tried to argue, but the judge silenced them. This court will not tolerate unethical behavior, especially when it preys on the vulnerable. Mr. Cooper, you have the court's support in seeking justice. As Daniel left the courtroom, he was surrounded by reporters and supporters. Cameras flashed, and microphones were thrust in his face. But he barely heard their questions. His mind was focused on the road ahead. He had won a crucial battle, but the war for his land, and his dignity, was far from over. Later that night, Daniel, Henry, and Elizabeth sat in a small diner, the glow of victory tempered by the challenges still ahead. What happens now? Daniel asked. Elizabeth sipped her coffee, her expression thoughtful. The injunction buys us time. Harland and Company won't back down easily, they have too much to lose. But if we can prove the auction was illegal, you'll have a strong case to reclaim your property. Henry leaned back in his chair, a mischievous glint in his eye. And if they try to play dirty, we'll hit them right back. Daniel smiled, feeling a spark of hope for the first time in years. I'm ready, he said. Whatever it takes, I'll fight. The next morning, Daniel received an unexpected call from Joe, the investigator. His voice was tense. Dan, I've been looking into Harland and Company some more. There's something you need to know. It's about the land. Daniel's stomach tightened. What is it? Joe hesitated, then said, I think the reason they wanted your land so badly, it's not just for the development. There's something buried there, something worth millions. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. What are you talking about? Joe sighed. I don't have all the details yet, but I'm working on it. Just be careful. If Harland and Company find out we're onto them, they won't play nice. As Daniel hung up the phone, his mind reeled. What could possibly be buried on his land? And how far would Harland and Company go to keep it hidden? Daniel sat on the edge of his bed at the shelter, staring at the phone in his hand. Joe's words echoed in his mind. Something buried there, something worth millions. The notion felt surreal. The land he had purchased so many years ago, the patch of earth he had dreamed of building a home on, might hold a secret worth fighting over. But if that was true, it explained why Harland and Company were so desperate to hold on to it. The next morning, Daniel met Joe and Henry at a small office downtown. Joe spread a collection of maps, documents, and photographs across a table, his expression serious. "I found this in the county archives," Joe said, pointing to a faded map of the area from the 1800s. "Your land sits on what used to be a mining claim. Back in the day, they were digging for all kinds of minerals, gold, silver, even rare earth elements. Most of the mines dried up, but not all of them were fully explored." Daniel frowned, leaning closer. "Are you saying there might be something valuable left underground?" Joe nodded. "It's possible. Harland and Company would have known this. They've got teams of surveyors and geologists who scope out properties before they buy. If they found anything worth extracting, they'd have every reason to bury the truth about how they acquired the land." Henry whistled, shaking his head. "No wonder they went through so much trouble. They're not just building a luxury development, they're sitting on a gold mine." The revelation ignited a fire in Daniel. He wasn't just fighting for a piece of land anymore, he was standing up against a corporation that had preyed on him and countless others. But he also knew that uncovering the truth wouldn't be easy. Over the next few days, Daniel and Joe worked tirelessly to gather more evidence. They combed through public records, interviewed former employees of Harland and Company, and even visited the site under the cover of darkness to look for signs of recent drilling or surveying. What they found only deepened their suspicions: markings on the ground that resembled test drilling sites, and equipment stored in a nearby shed that looked out of place for a residential project. Meanwhile, Elizabeth continued to build the legal case. She filed motions to compel Harland and Company to produce records of their activities on the property, as well as documents related to the auction. The corporation's lawyers fought back fiercely, delaying proceedings and attempting to discredit Daniel at every turn. One evening, as Daniel walked back to the shelter, he noticed a black SUV parked across the street. It wasn't the first time he had seen the vehicle. For the past few days, it had shown up in different places: outside the diner where he met Henry, near Joe's office, even outside the courthouse. A chill ran down his spine. Were they being followed? He quickened his pace, keeping his head down. When he reached the shelter, he slipped inside without looking back. But the feeling of unease lingered. He knew Harland and Company wouldn't take their fight lying down. The next morning, Daniel shared his concerns with Joe and Henry. Joe nodded grimly. "I've been noticing it too. We're rattling their cage, and they don't like it." Henry, always the optimist, grinned. "Good. Let them squirm. It means we're onto something big." But Daniel couldn't shake the sense of danger. He had fought in wars, faced life-and-death situations, but this was different. The enemy here was invisible, operating in shadows and using money and power as weapons. Later that day, Elizabeth called with urgent news. "Daniel, we've got a problem," she said. "Harland and Company just filed a counterclaim. They're accusing you of fabricating the deed and are petitioning to have your case dismissed." Daniel's stomach sank. "Can they do that?" "They can try," Elizabeth said. "But we won't let them. It's a desperate move on their part, which means they're feeling the pressure. We just have to stay one step ahead." That evening, as Daniel and Henry prepared to leave the diner, the black SUV pulled up outside. Two men in suits stepped out, their expressions cold and calculating. They walked straight to Daniel, blocking his path. "Mr. Cooper," one of them said, his tone flat. "We need to have a word." Henry stepped forward, his chest puffed out. "If you've got something to say, you can say it to both of us." The man ignored him, focusing on Daniel. "This fight isn't worth it," he said. "You're not going to win. Walk away now, and we'll make it worth your while." Daniel's fists clenched at his sides. "You're wasting your time. I'm not walking away from this." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Think carefully, Mr. Cooper. You have more to lose than you realize." With that, the men turned and left, climbing back into the SUV and driving away. Henry cursed under his breath, shaking his head. "They're trying to scare you. Don't let them." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I'm not scared," he said. "But they just made this personal." The confrontation only fueled Daniel's determination. The next day, he met with Elizabeth, Joe, and Henry to regroup. "We need to hit them harder," Daniel said. "If they're willing to intimidate me, they must be hiding something huge." Joe nodded. "I've got a contact in the State Mining Bureau. They might have records on the land's mineral deposits. If Harland and Company knew there was something valuable there, it'll be on file." Elizabeth added, "And I'll escalate the legal proceedings." If we can prove they've tampered with public records or violated state auction laws, it'll undermine their entire case. That evening, Daniel returned to the shelter, exhausted but hopeful. As he climbed into bed, he couldn't help but wonder what the next day would bring. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like he had a real shot at winning. But in the middle of the night, he was jolted awake by the sound of shattering glass. He sat up, heart pounding, as flames lit up the darkness outside the window. Someone had set fire to the shelter's courtyard. The orange glow of flames danced on the walls as chaos erupted inside the shelter. People shouted, children cried, and the acrid smell of smoke filled the air. Daniel sprang out of bed, his military instincts kicking in. "Everyone stay calm," he shouted, his voice cutting through the panic. "Get to the fire exits now." He rushed through the halls, helping those who struggled to move. An elderly man clung to his arm, coughing heavily as Daniel guided him to safety. As the fire alarm blared, Daniel looked back to ensure no one was left behind. When he finally stepped outside, the scene was both a relief and a horror. The courtyard was ablaze, but everyone had made it out safely. Shelter staff did their best to corral the residents, while fire trucks screeched to a halt at the curb. Henry appeared beside him, his face pale. "You think this was an accident?" he asked, though the answer was clear in his tone. Daniel shook his head, his jaw tightening. No. This was a message. As the fire department worked to extinguish the blaze, Daniel spoke to the shelter's director, a kind woman named Margie. She was visibly shaken, her hands trembling as she clutched a clipboard. "I don't understand," she said. "Why would someone do this?" Daniel hesitated. He didn't want to involve her or the shelter residents in his battle, but the attack felt too targeted to ignore. "I think this might have something to do with me," he admitted. "I've been fighting a legal case against a powerful company. They've been trying to intimidate me." Margie's eyes widened. "Daniel, if they're willing to go this far, they won't scare me off," he said firmly. "But I'm sorry you and everyone else here got caught in the crossfire." Margie placed a hand on his arm. "We'll be okay. Just promise me you'll stay safe." Daniel nodded, though the promise felt hollow. Safety was no longer an option, not for him. The next day, Daniel met with Elizabeth and Joe, relaying the events of the fire. Elizabeth's face darkened as she listened. "This isn't just intimidation anymore," she said. "This is escalation. We need to report this to the authorities." Joe nodded. "I'll start digging. If Harland and Company had anything to do with this, I'll find out." Daniel hesitated. "I don't want to drag innocent people into this. The shelter residents have already been through enough." Elizabeth gave him a sympathetic look. "I understand, but this isn't just about you anymore. If Harland and Company are willing to put lives at risk, we have to expose them." Meanwhile, the fight in court continued. Elizabeth filed an emergency motion to investigate Harland and Company's business practices, presenting evidence of their history of intimidation and shady deals. The judge, already wary of the corporation's actions, agreed to allow a deeper inquiry. Harland and Company's lawyers pushed back, calling the motion baseless and accusing Daniel of seeking sympathy. But Elizabeth's arguments were compelling, and the judge ordered Harland and Company to produce internal documents for review. The company's legal team looked visibly shaken, a rare crack in their otherwise polished facade. While the legal battle raged on, Joe uncovered a lead. His contact at the State Mining Bureau confirmed that Harland and Company had requested surveys for the land Daniel once owned. The results of those surveys were confidential, but their existence alone was suspicious. "What does it mean?" Daniel asked as they reviewed the findings in Joe's office. "It means they knew something was there," Joe said. "They wouldn't spend money on surveys unless they were confident it'd pay off. My guess? They found something valuable, maybe gold, maybe something else, and they've been trying to keep it quiet." Henry leaned back in his chair, whistling low. "No wonder they're pulling out all the stops to keep that land." Daniel felt a mix of anger and determination. "Then we'll stop them. Whatever it takes." But Harland and Company weren't done playing dirty. 2 days later, Elizabeth called Daniel with troubling news. "They're filing a countersuit," she said. "They're claiming you're defaming them by accusing them of illegal activity." Daniel rubbed his temples, frustration boiling over. "Can they do that?" "They can try," Elizabeth said. "It's a classic intimidation tactic. They want to drag you down with legal fees and distractions. But don't worry, we'll fight this too." The pressure mounted, but Daniel refused to back down. With each passing day, he grew more determined to expose the truth. He spent hours poring over records, meeting with Joe and Elizabeth, and rallying support from the community. At the same time, his bond with Henry deepened. The two men often stayed up late, talking about their pasts, their dreams, and the twists of fate that had brought them to this fight. For Daniel, the friendship was a lifeline, a reminder that he wasn't alone. Then one night, Joe called with urgent news. "I've got something big," he said, his voice trembling with excitement. "I found an old geological report on your land. It's not just valuable, it's one of the richest deposits in the state." Daniel's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Joe continued, "your land is sitting on top of a massive vein of rare earth minerals. We're talking millions, maybe even billions of dollars." Daniel felt the weight of the revelation settle over him. The land he had fought so hard to protect wasn't just a dream or a home, it was a treasure, one that Harland and Company would stop at nothing to control. As the implications sank in, Daniel realized the stakes had just skyrocketed. The fight was no longer just about justice or fairness. It was about uncovering the truth, and surviving the storm that was about to hit. Daniel sat in Joe's office, staring at the geological report spread out on the table. The words blurred as his mind raced. Millions, maybe billions of dollars. It explained everything. The shady auction, the legal intimidation, even the fire at the shelter. Harland and Company had known about this all along. "We need to get this to the judge," Daniel said, his voice steady but his hands shaking. "If the court sees this, they'll have to take action." Joe nodded but looked cautious. "We will. But we need to be smart about how we present it. This isn't just evidence, it's a weapon. If Harland and Company find out we have this before we're ready, they'll do everything they can to discredit or destroy it." Henry leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean? Isn't this an open and shut case now?" Joe shook his head. "Not yet. They've got money, power, and a team of lawyers who'll twist this any way they can. We've got to be airtight." Daniel clenched his fists. "So what's the plan?" The next morning, Elizabeth met with Daniel and Joe to strategize. The first step was filing the geological report with the court as part of their evidence against Harland and Company. The report would strengthen their claim that the company had manipulated the auction process to acquire the land unlawfully. But Elizabeth warned them to tread carefully. "This is going to escalate things," she said. "Once we file this, Harland and Company will know exactly how much is at stake. They'll come at us with everything they've got." Daniel nodded. "Let them. I'm not backing down." Elizabeth smiled, admiration flickering in her eyes. "I didn't think you would." As the filing moved forward, word began to spread about the true value of Daniel's land. The media, already captivated by his story, seized on the new development. Headlines proclaimed, "Homeless veterans' land could be worth billions," and reporters swarmed Daniel wherever he went. Support for him grew, but so did the scrutiny. Harland and Company wasted no time launching their counterattack. They issued a press release claiming that the geological report was a fabrication and accusing Daniel of orchestrating a smear campaign against the company. Their lawyers filed motions to dismiss the report as inadmissible, arguing it was unverified and irrelevant. Elizabeth fought back, submitting additional evidence to prove the report's legitimacy. The battle became a war of motions and countermotions, each side digging deeper into their arsenal. Meanwhile, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that Harland and Company were watching his every move. The black SUV was back, parked outside the shelter one evening. When he tried to approach it, the vehicle sped off, its tinted windows concealing whoever was inside. Henry wasn't as restrained. "Let me catch one of them creeping around," he muttered one night, a metal pipe in his hand. "I'll give them something to think about." Daniel grabbed his arm, stopping him. "We're not stooping to their level. This fight is in the courtroom, not the streets." Henry sighed, lowering the pipe. "Fine. But they better hope they stay in that car." A week later, the case took a shocking turn. Daniel and his team arrived at the courthouse to find a crowd gathered outside. Protesters held signs denouncing Harland and Company, while reporters jostled for position. But the mood shifted when a harried clerk rushed out to Elizabeth, a thick envelope in hand. She tore it open, her face darkening as she read. "They're countersuing for libel and fraud," she said, handing the papers to Daniel. "They're claiming you falsified the geological report." Daniel's stomach churned. "But it's real. We have proof. Elizabeth nodded. I know. But this is their strategy, to bog us down with so many lawsuits that we can't focus on the main case. They're trying to bury you under legal fees and stress. The following days were a blur of meetings, filings, and courtroom battles. Elizabeth's team worked tirelessly to defend against the countersuit while keeping the main case on track. The judge, growing frustrated with Harland and Company's tactics, issued a stern warning. This court will not tolerate attempts to derail these proceedings. But Harland and Company had more tricks up their sleeve. One evening, as Daniel and Henry were walking back to the shelter, they were ambushed by two men in dark suits. The men shoved them into a nearby alley, their intentions clear. Here's how it works, one of them growled, grabbing Daniel by the collar. You drop the case, and this all goes away. Keep pushing, and things get worse. Henry lunged forward, landing a punch that sent one of the men stumbling. Get your hands off him, he roared, his voice echoing down the alley. The other man pulled something from his pocket, something that gleamed in the dim light. A knife. Daniel stepped between them, his voice firm despite the fear in his chest. If you think this is going to scare me off, you don't know who you're dealing with. The men hesitated, clearly not expecting resistance. After a tense standoff, they backed away, muttering threats as they disappeared into the night. Henry was still fuming as they returned to the shelter. They're getting desperate, he said. That means we're winning. Daniel nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. The attack was a reminder of how far Harland and Company were willing to go. If they couldn't win in court, they'd try to silence him by other means. The next day, Elizabeth called an emergency meeting. We need to escalate, she said, her tone urgent. Harland and Company are crossing lines, and the court needs to know. I'm filing a motion to request federal oversight of this case. If we can get the feds involved, it'll take the pressure off you and shift the focus onto them. Joe chimed in. And I've got another lead. I found a former employee of Harland and Company who's willing to talk. They've got inside knowledge about the auction and the company's practices. Daniel felt a surge of hope. When can we meet them? Joe hesitated. There's a catch. They're scared. They'll only talk if we can guarantee their safety. Elizabeth nodded. We'll make it happen. But we need to move fast. If Harland and Company find out about this whistleblower, they'll do everything they can to shut them down. That evening, Daniel couldn't sleep. The weight of the fight was pressing down on him, but so was the hope of victory. The whistleblower could be the key to everything, a way to expose Harland and Company's corruption once and for all. But as he lay staring at the ceiling, his phone buzzed with a message. The number was unknown, but the words sent a chill through his body. You should have walked away, Cooper. This is your final warning. Daniel stared at the message, his pulse pounding in his ears. The threat was clear, but the anonymity of the sender made it more unsettling. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He couldn't let fear control him, not when he was so close to uncovering the truth. The next morning, he shared the message with Elizabeth, Henry, and Joe during a meeting at Joe's office. Elizabeth's brow furrowed as she read it. This isn't just intimidation anymore, she said. This is a criminal threat. We need to report this. Daniel shook his head. We can't afford to get distracted. If we report it, it'll just slow us down. Henry leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Dan, they're trying to scare you into backing off. Reporting it might not stop them, but it sends a message. We're not afraid. Joe nodded in agreement. Plus, having this on record strengthens your case. It shows a pattern of harassment. Daniel hesitated, then finally relented. All right. Report it. But we stay focused on the whistleblower. That's our priority. Elizabeth arranged for the whistleblower, a former employee of Harland and Company named Natalie Kane, to meet with them in a secure location. Natalie had worked in the company's legal department for years, but her conscience had finally caught up with her. She claimed to have seen internal emails and documents detailing how the company manipulated auctions, falsified records, and bribed officials to acquire properties. The meeting was held in a small office building after hours. Daniel, Elizabeth, Joe, and Natalie sat around a table, the blinds drawn, while Henry waited outside to keep watch. Natalie was visibly nervous, her hands trembling as she passed a flash drive across the table. This has everything I could find, she said. Emails, memos, contracts. It's all there. But you need to be careful. If they find out I gave this to you, they'll come after me. Elizabeth placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "You did the right thing, Natalie. We'll make sure you're protected." Joe plugged the flash drive into his laptop, his eyes widening as he scrolled through the files. "This is gold," he muttered. "They've got memos explicitly discussing how they target vulnerable owners and manipulate auctions. This isn't just shady, it's outright illegal." Daniel leaned forward, his heart racing. "This proves everything we've been saying." Elizabeth nodded. "It's more than enough to bring the case to federal court. With this, we can't lose." The next day, Elizabeth filed a motion to introduce Natalie's testimony and the documents into evidence. The judge, recognizing the significance of the new information, granted the motion and set a date for Natalie's testimony. Harland and Company's lawyers scrambled to respond, but their confidence was visibly shaken. Meanwhile, Joe analyzed the files further, uncovering details that made the situation even more dire. Among the documents was a geological survey that confirmed Harland and Company had known about the mineral deposits on Daniel's land long before the auction. The survey also included a valuation that placed the worth of the resources in the billions. Daniel sat in stunned silence as Joe explained. "They didn't just manipulate the auction to get your land. They did it knowing they were stealing a fortune." Elizabeth added, "This turns the case from a property dispute into a corporate scandal. If we can prove they used illegal methods to acquire your land, it could result in criminal charges." But Harland and Company weren't going down without a fight. 2 days before Natalie's scheduled testimony, she disappeared. Daniel received a panicked call from Joe, who had been trying to reach her all morning. "She's not answering her phone," Joe said. "I went by her apartment, and it's completely empty. It looks like she left in a hurry." Daniel felt a sinking feeling in his chest. "You think they got to her?" Joe hesitated. "I don't know. But I wouldn't put it past them." Elizabeth immediately contacted the authorities, reporting Natalie as a missing person. She also filed an emergency motion to admit her documents into evidence without her testimony, arguing that her disappearance was likely tied to the case. The judge agreed to review the motion but warned that without Natalie's testimony, the documents might not carry as much weight. The disappearance cast a shadow over the case, but Daniel refused to lose hope. He rallied the support of the community, speaking at town halls and organizing events to raise awareness about Harland and Company's practices. People began to come forward with their own stories of being targeted by the corporation, further bolstering his case. One evening, as Daniel was leaving an event, he was approached by a young man who introduced himself as Jason Kane, Natalie's younger brother. "She's not missing," Jason said, glancing around nervously. "She's in hiding." Daniel's eyes widened. "Where is she? Is she safe?" Jason nodded. "She's safe, but she's terrified. She said someone was following her, so she went underground. She wanted me to tell you she's sorry for disappearing but that she's rooting for you." Daniel felt a wave of relief, tempered by concern. "Can you get a message to her? Tell her we need her testimony. It's the key to everything." Jason hesitated, then nodded. "I'll try. But she's scared, and I don't blame her. These people, they're dangerous." As the trial date approached, Daniel and his team worked tirelessly to prepare their case. The stakes had never been higher, and the tension was palpable. Harland and Company continued their attempts to discredit him, but the mountain of evidence was growing too large to ignore. Then, on the eve of the trial, Daniel received a call from an unknown number. He answered cautiously, his heart pounding. "Mr. Cooper," a voice said, smooth and cold. "This is your last chance. Drop the case, or we'll make sure you regret it." Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. "I've come this far. Do you really think a threat is going to stop me now?" The voice chuckled. "You're brave, I'll give you that. But bravery won't protect you. Walk away, Mr. Cooper. It's your only option." The line went dead, leaving Daniel standing in the dark, his resolve stronger than ever. The next morning, as Daniel walked into the courthouse, he noticed a familiar figure waiting for him. Natalie stood by the steps, her face pale but determined. She gave him a small nod, and he felt a surge of gratitude and hope. "You came back," he said, his voice full of emotion. She smiled faintly. "I couldn't let them win." Together, they walked into the courtroom, ready to face whatever came next. The courtroom was packed as Daniel and Natalie entered. A ripple of surprise spread through the room as people recognized Natalie, her unexpected return a sign that the battle was far from over. The judge called the court to order, and the tension in the room was palpable. Natalie took the stand, her hands trembling slightly as she was sworn in. She glanced at Daniel, who gave her an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, she began to tell her story. "I worked in the legal department at Harland & Company for 6 years," she said. "During that time, I witnessed numerous unethical practices, including the manipulation of property auctions, falsification of records, and intimidation of property owners." The prosecutor, representing Harland & Company, quickly objected. "Your Honor, this testimony is speculative and lacks evidence." The judge frowned. Overruled. "The witness may continue." Natalie nodded, steeling herself. "I have documents to support my claims," she said, gesturing to the flash drive Elizabeth had submitted as evidence. "These include internal emails, memos, and contracts that outline the company's strategies for acquiring properties like Mr. Cooper's." She went on to describe how Harland & Company had specifically targeted Daniel's land after discovering its mineral wealth. "They knew about the geological survey long before the auction," she said. "They falsified records to make it appear as though the land was abandoned, even though Mr. Cooper had tried to communicate with the county." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Natalie's testimony continued. The prosecutor tried to discredit her, accusing her of fabricating the documents and seeking revenge against her former employer. But Natalie held firm, her answers precise and unwavering. When the cross-examination ended, Elizabeth rose to redirect. "Ms. Kane, why did you decide to come forward despite the risks?" Natalie looked directly at Daniel. "Because people like Mr. Cooper deserve justice. Harland & Company have gotten away with this for too long." Someone had to speak out. As the trial progressed, Elizabeth introduced the geological survey and other evidence to bolster their case. Joe testified about his investigation, detailing how he had uncovered the discrepancies in the auction process and the company's attempts to cover their tracks. Each piece of evidence painted a damning picture of Harland & Company's corruption. The corporation's legal team fought back, trying to dismiss the evidence as circumstantial. But the judge, increasingly frustrated with their tactics, allowed most of it to stand. The tide was turning, and it was clear that Harland & Company were on the defensive. Outside the courtroom, Daniel's story continued to capture the public's attention. Support poured in from across the country, letters from veterans, donations to his legal fund, and even offers of pro bono assistance from high-profile attorneys. The case had become more than a fight over land. It was a symbol of resilience and justice. But Harland & Company weren't done. One night, as Daniel and Henry left the courthouse, they were nearly run off the road by a black SUV. The vehicle sped off before they could get a clear look at the driver, but the message was clear: Harland & Company were willing to resort to violence to silence them. Henry was livid. "That's it," he growled. "We're going to the police." Daniel nodded, his expression grim. "They can't get away with this." The incident was reported, and Elizabeth filed a motion to request additional security for Daniel and his team. The judge approved it, assigning officers to protect them during the remainder of the trial. The final day of the trial arrived, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. Elizabeth delivered a powerful closing argument, weaving together the evidence and testimony into an undeniable narrative of corruption and greed. "Mr. Cooper's land was stolen from him," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Not because he abandoned it, but because he was vulnerable. Harland & Company exploited that vulnerability for their own gain, manipulating the system and breaking the law. This case isn't just about one man, it's about holding those in power accountable." The prosecutor's closing argument tried to paint Daniel as a desperate man clinging to a false claim, but the cracks in their case were impossible to ignore. The evidence was overwhelming, and the courtroom could feel it. After hours of deliberation, the judge returned with a decision. The room fell silent as he addressed the court. "After careful consideration of the evidence and testimony presented, this court finds that Harland & Company acted unlawfully in their acquisition of Mr. Cooper's property. The auction is hereby deemed invalid, and ownership of the land is restored to Mr. Cooper." The gallery erupted in applause, and Daniel felt a wave of emotion wash over him. The judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, this court recommends a federal investigation into Harland & Company's business practices, as the evidence suggests a pattern of systemic corruption. As Daniel stepped out of the courthouse, the crowd outside erupted into cheers. Reporters swarmed him, but he barely noticed. He turned to Henry, Joe, Natalie, and Elizabeth, his voice thick with emotion. "We did it," he said, a smile breaking across his face. "We actually did it." Elizabeth placed a hand on his shoulder. You did it, Daniel. You never gave up. That night, Daniel visited the land that had started it all. The old oak tree still stood, its branches reaching toward the stars. He sat beneath it, the weight of the battle finally lifting. The land was his again, not just in name, but in spirit. But he knew the fight wasn't over. Harland and Company would face a reckoning, and Daniel was determined to ensure that justice was served, not just for himself, but for everyone they had wronged. The courtroom victory marked the beginning of a new chapter in Daniel's life, but the battle against Harland and Company was far from over. With the judge's recommendation for a federal investigation, the wheels of justice began turning at a higher level. Federal agents raided Harland and Company's headquarters, seizing documents and hard drives as the company's executives scrambled to contain the fallout. The story dominated the news for weeks. Reports uncovered widespread corruption, illegal land grabs, bribery, and cover-ups that had gone unnoticed for years. Harland and Company's once pristine reputation crumbled, and lawsuits poured in from victims who had suffered similar injustices. For Daniel, the victory was bittersweet. His land was restored, but the fight had taken its toll. He spent weeks repairing the damage left behind by the developers, clearing debris, and tending to the old oak tree that had stood as a silent witness to it all. One morning, as Daniel walked the perimeter of his property, he noticed a group of people gathered near the tree. They were veterans like him, carrying tools and supplies. At the front of the group was Henry, grinning ear to ear. "We figured you could use a hand," Henry said, clapping Daniel on the back. "You're not rebuilding this place alone." Touched, Daniel nodded, his voice catching in his throat. Together, they worked to transform the land into something greater than Daniel had ever imagined. A community center for veterans and the homeless, a place where people could find support, shelter, and hope. As the months passed, the center became a beacon of light in the community. Volunteers poured in, offering everything from carpentry skills to free meals. Daniel's story continued to inspire others, drawing attention to the struggles of homeless veterans and the systemic issues they faced. Natalie, now working for a non-profit legal organization, often visited to provide free legal advice to those in need. Joe, ever the investigator, volunteered his time teaching workshops on tenants' rights and property laws. Elizabeth remained a staunch ally, using her platform to advocate for legislative reforms to protect vulnerable property owners. Meanwhile, the fallout from Harland and Company's corruption scandal continued to ripple. Several executives were indicted on federal charges, and the company filed for bankruptcy under the weight of its legal troubles. The case became a landmark in property law, leading to stricter regulations on auctions and greater protections for vulnerable individuals. Daniel, however, remained humble through it all. "I didn't win this fight alone," he often said. "It took a village, people who believed in justice, in kindness, and in doing what's right." One afternoon, as Daniel sat beneath the old oak tree, a young boy approached him. The boy held a drawing, crayon lines forming a picture of the community center and the tree. "Is this your tree?" the boy asked, his eyes wide. Daniel smiled, looking up at the branches swaying in the breeze. "It's ours," he said. "And it always will be." The boy grinned and ran back to his parents, who waved at Daniel from a distance. He waved back, his heart full. The land, once stolen and nearly forgotten, had become a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of standing up for what's right. As the sun set that evening, Daniel stood on the hill overlooking the land he had fought so hard to reclaim. The voices of the community drifted up to him, laughter, conversation, the sounds of life. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. The land was more than just dirt and trees. It was a place of healing, a home for those who had nowhere else to go, and a reminder that even in the face of impossible odds, hope and perseverance could prevail. Daniel turned, heading back toward the center, his steps steady and purposeful. There was still work to be done, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face whatever came next.